that we definitely have time for everything. This is being recorded. I'll share the recording. I'll also be sharing the slides, and we'll be going over the logistics for getting feedback on your abstracts from a faculty member, and if you would like, from a peer as well, who is currently attending. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. So before I get started, I just want to note that this presentation is based on the amazing precedents set by Matt Hall and Amy Decter and their prior presentations from a few years ago. So very much indebted to them for starting the foundation of this workshop. So what we'll be starting with is we'll start about talking about just generally what PAA is, what you can get out of it. For some of you, this will very much be review if you've perhaps been to PAA before, but hopefully it still has some interesting tidbits. And then we'll talk about the process for submitting abstracts, what organizers are looking for, and what that process is once you've submitted your abstract and you're waiting to hear back. And then we'll talk about some concrete tips for positioning your abstract in a way that will hopefully get it more attention. Of course, this is a learning process, and I do want to emphasize that this is also a competitive process. And so, you know, if you go through all of this and you submit your abstract and, you know, you don't get accepted into PAA, never fear. This is something that oftentimes people have to apply to a couple of times or a few times before getting a presentation. So I want to acknowledge that it's not a reflection of you and your work, but just this competitive process. So PAA will hopefully, fingers crossed, be happening in Atlanta, Georgia from April 6th to 9th next year. So the plan is to have it in person, which is exciting. It's been a little while since it's been as far south as it is in the coming year. So that's kind of fun and exciting. And it's a little bit earlier than it is usually as well. So make sure that's on your radar, that some of these deadlines for submitting your paper is just a little earlier than sometimes. So if you're not really familiar with PAA, PAA is the Population Association of America, and it's the largest professional organization in demography, which is sort of obvious when you learn that they publish the journal Demography, which predictably is the flagship journal of demography. So lots of original titling there. And they're very research and outreach focused. So of course, it's an important institution for researchers to come together, but they are also really interested in policy and getting involved in terms of applying research. This was really big. They were very involved in terms of the 2020 census and trying to make sure the census was done as well and as equitably as possible. So that's just one example of the outreach focus. It's also a global organization. There are 3,000 members globally, which is overall pretty large, but at the same time, it's not as large as some organizations like the American Sociological Association or the American Public Health Association. So it's kind of this perfect middle ground where when you go to the PAA meeting, it tends to, you know, be large enough where you're exposed to a lot of great research, but it has a bit more intimacy, a lot of people find, than some of those annual conferences that are held by these larger organizations. More specifically at the conferences, usually about 2,000 to 2,500 people have attended since 2010. And there's a really cool mix. About 30% of attendees are students, which is great for making research connections and collaborations. I think students are often doing the most innovative research, and you'll often find students are the best prepared in their presentations. So that can make for some really interesting material. And then 20% of attendees come from outside of the United States. So you get a lot of breadth and depth in terms of research outside of the US as well. And CSDE has traditionally had a pretty strong presence at PAA. We've sent usually about 40 to 50 students and affiliates each year. And that includes 2021, when of course sent is kind of a metaphorical word. But again, we have a pretty great presence. So you'll often see people that you can kind of hang out with as well when you're getting your feet wet with this. So PAA has a really cool interdisciplinary focus, just like CSDE does, which is one of the things many people really love about it. So these are the research areas that PAA outlines and how members fall into these interdisciplinary areas. You can see there is an especially large presence of people who are interested in fertility, health, mortality. But then there isn't a majority of people, even close to a majority, that fall in any of these areas. There's a lot of diversity, people who focus on migration, aging, children and youth, etc. And I should note that this list of research areas is a little bit dated. They've recently, in the past year or two, expanded some of these research areas, but they don't have updated percentages for how their members fall into these areas. So some of the changes is recently they've broken apart that health and mortality group into a health and health behaviors group and a mortality and morbidity group. Gender, race, and ethnicity has very appropriately been broken apart into a gender and sexuality group and a race and ethnicity substantive group. And then they've added some areas as well, like historical demography, spatial demography, and COVID-19 as well. So again, just highlighting the interdisciplinary focus of many members and the fact that you can always find somebody who's doing, I should say almost always, that's doing somewhat similar work. So why should you attend? There are a few big reasons. First of all, it's really valuable for showcasing your work. Like I said, you can very often find people who are doing similar research. And so it's a really cool opportunity to present and discuss research with like-minded researchers who can give you really targeted and helpful feedback. And many people even say, myself included, that they've gotten the best feedback at PAA. I think oftentimes you can go to conferences and just get questions that are sort of clarifying questions or things that aren't really helpful. But at PAA, I found I tend to get really great constructive feedback. And it's also a good CV builder, which is really huge when you're early in your graduate career. You haven't had time maybe to publish many, if any, articles in journals because that process is so long and complicated. And so attending conferences like PAA is a great opportunity to show your productivity, show your research, and highlight that, again, before you often have many peer-reviewed publications. It's also great because a lot of innovative research is presented, cutting-edge methods, new topics. And so it's great for generating new research ideas and identifying research gaps. Another huge thing is that it's really valuable for strengthening your research network. So if you've ever had researchers that you've always wanted to meet, then this is a really cool opportunity to reach out to them before you attend and ask if they would be willing to meet you for coffee, to meet after, a presentation, and to make those connections. And then you can also have these things happen more organically. If you're attending presentations, you might go talk to a speaker afterwards, or might ask a question of them and make a connection later, or meet up with students. There are a lot of student events here. So that's a really great opportunity that I highly recommend you take advantage of. If you, like me, are a little bit of an introverted person and that can be kind of difficult, I'd recommend reaching out to your mentor and seeing if they can also help facilitate connections or recommend people you might reach out to. And then last but not least, and one that's sort of obvious, I guess, in a sense, is enhancing your presentation skills and getting that great practice. And not only do you learn from getting that practice, but you also learn from seeing other people present and what works, and sometimes most informatively, what doesn't work. I think especially when you see how people respond to questions and Q&A, that can be really informative for, again, what works and doesn't for those approaches. I'm going to pause for just a moment. Are there any questions that people have? Great. So hopefully by being here, you all have a certain level of interest in attending PAA already. So hopefully that just kind of reinforces some excitement for it. So what is the schedule for actually doing that? So the call for papers came out a few weeks ago, and submissions are due on September 26th, which is inconveniently a Sunday. So keep that in mind. And then November 15th to 19th is when authors will be notified if they've been accepted into a regular or flash session. And I'll talk about what those different sessions mean. But those are kind of the main sessions that you'll probably be applying for. And if you're not accepted to those and you've indicated that you're willing to be considered for a poster or an overflow session, you'll usually hear a few weeks later, December 6th through 10th, if you've been accepted into one of those. And then March 16th, your papers are due. They don't have to be perfect, ready to send out to a publication right after PAA, but they should be complete enough so that your discussants can read them and give you feedback. And then April 6th to 9th is conference time. Again, hopefully it'll be in person, but as we're all seeing, who really knows? So there are a few different types of sessions that you can consider applying for. The first one is the regular session. This is sort of the most traditional option. That's an oral presentation. It's 10 to 15 minutes, depending on how many people are in your session. I would say most typically it's a 12-minute presentation. And then relatively new within the past few years is a really cool session called a flash session. And if you've ever been to our lightning talks, it's really similar. It's sort of a more expanded version of that. And in fact, some UW researchers were really instrumental in actually creating these sessions at PAA. And the first part is a 4 to 6 minute oral presentation. And that's followed by a poster session that's more informal, where people who attended the oral presentation will walk around and ask you questions. So it's a really great way of having that oral presentation, set things up and facilitate discussion for then the poster session. So a lot of people really enjoy that. And then the poster session is another really cool opportunity. I highly encourage you to consider doing a poster presentation if you're not accepted into one of these. It's more informal. There are a few different time slots where a bunch of people will present their posters, and there's a more informal give and take where people just walk up to your poster and will usually say something like, "Tell me about your research," and then you give your spiel and they ask you questions. But it's cool for a variety of reasons. One, there's a poster prize, so that's kind of nice. And another is that it can actually be one of the more natural ways of networking with people. Sometimes in oral presentations, there isn't really time for that. But in poster sessions, you can have really in-depth conversations with people. So that's really cool. And so, like I mentioned earlier, this is a really competitive process. PAA usually receives about 4,000 submissions, and there's space for around 950 oral presentations, or those regular sessions, about 90 flash presentations, and 1,050 poster presentations. So if you're interested in any of these things, there's about a 50-50 chance of getting accepted into PAA. And if you have strong preferences for one or the other, of course, that also influences the probability. So again, just keep that in mind. I know it can always be hard when you don't get accepted, but just remember that this is a hard thing to get into sometimes. Nicholas, I see you unmuted yourself. Do you have a question or a comment?
Oh, sorry. No, I've been unmuted the whole time.
Oh, no worries. Sorry. Does anybody else have a question or a comment? while I'm paused? Great. So you have two options for submitting your work. One that we'll talk a lot less about today is submitting a full or partially full paper. And the other, which we'll talk more about, is submitting an extended abstract. And along with those, you also have to submit a short abstract, which can feel a little silly when you've just done, an extended abstract, which is already pretty short, but you will need to do both of those. So the first thing I want to talk about is what it means to submit a full paper. So you have the option of submitting a full paper, and I put that in quotes because it doesn't actually have to be completely full. It doesn't have to be totally complete, again, polished, ready to send out. And this is an option I've taken advantage of many times, even if my paper isn't close to complete. So usually I'll take advantage of this option if I have most of my front end of a paper pretty well written, like the background, theory, hypotheses. Maybe I've written up the data and method section, but I don't have results yet, or the results are really incomplete. There's maybe just like a descriptive table or something. That's totally fine. You do not need results if you're submitting a quote unquote full paper. You just need to hint at what results you expect to find and highlight how you feel like the paper is still important, kind of regardless of those results. So this is something I really like. Again, if I have a paper in progress, especially if I want to submit maybe multiple things to PAA, and maybe I want to submit an extended abstract, and I also have this partially complete paper, to save myself the time of writing a couple of extended abstracts, I'll sometimes just submit the full paper and then focus on an extended abstract for something that I really want to highlight. So again, this can be a nice time saver if you already have something in the works. That being said, we don't focus on recommending you submit a full paper just because organizers are looking at tons of papers and extended abstracts, tons of submissions, I should say. And so extended abstracts are sort of the best way to quickly communicate your research and the merits of your research. But again, full papers are something that I think can be a good option. And a lot of people have the misunderstanding that they have to be totally complete.
Can I ask a question here?
Yeah, definitely.
So I guess this is maybe more related to conferences broadly, but what happens if you submit something and then 6 months down the road, your project turns out to be like extremely different, either because you hit roadblocks or you realized what you had thought about doing doesn't work out? Is it still all right to like present about the project, even if it's kind of not as advertised?
Yes, definitely. So that is something that has happened to me a number of times, where, usually it's not something totally different, like this is a completely different topic or anything. That would be a case where like, yeah, you probably want to bow out just because, as we'll talk about shortly, the organizers pick papers that are coherent thematically as well and in terms of their topic. So if it changes like to a huge dramatic extent, and is it almost a different topic, then that's where, you might be a little concerned. But if you have, say, framed your paper as having a particular focus or a particular contribution, and you found in the process that maybe you've switched the sample up a little bit, like maybe you're looking at gender interactions where you weren't before, or you're focused on like a particular subset, or you added a new outcome. Like those are all the sorts of things that are fine, and I think kind of expected when you're submitting at this early stage. Does that help? Are there follow-ups with that?
That helps, thanks.
I have a follow-up question.
Yeah.
Would it be more preferable to submit extended abstract rather than a full paper, since you mentioned the reviewer look at like so many papers, and would it be better if we submit like a more focused extended abstract than a full paper?
Yes, so we do encourage students to submit extended abstracts over full papers. Again, based on that expectation, the organizers will be able to focus more on what you're highlighting in the extended abstract rather than reading through a full paper and having to search a little bit more for like the contribution and the innovation. So we do encourage extended abstracts to a greater degree. We do kind of advertise them as having a higher chance of effectively communicating that. But that being said, again, I've had good success submitting full papers as well. The benefit of them is that I think they do more clearly show that you're relatively, that you'll be able to complete the work in time for the conference, which is something that sometimes organizers are concerned about. So if it's a really complex project and you think that that'll be a big concern of the organizers that you won't complete it in time, then maybe if you have like a pretty full paper about it, maybe that is a better option for you. But that would be, I would say, the main thing you would consider in that case.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions or follow-ups? Great. So an extended abstract is a short advertisement for your paper. It's 2 to 4 pages and can be single spaced. And that's including tables, I believe also figures as well. And extended abstracts, because of that length, need to be really clear and succinct. You really need to focus on communicating the merits of your work, its innovation, why it's important. And so that is why we encourage extended abstracts, because it is this good forum for really honing in on why your research is important and interesting and should be presented. So generally in these abstracts, you'll want to convince organizers of a few main things. Generally in order, you'll want to convince them of the relevance of your research. So why should we care? And relevance in terms of the topical nature of it usually. Does it have important connections to current events? Does it influence policy in some way? Will it move the literature forward? Those kinds of things. Related to this, but somewhat separate, is merit or innovation. This tends to have a little bit more to do with the method and the implementation. Are you using an innovative method, looking at a different sample of people than has usually been looked at? Are you improving the validity of research in some way? So again, relevance is a little bit more topical. Merit or innovation is a little bit more kind of methodological. And then finally, and sort of least importantly, but still important, is showing that you can pull this off before the conference. One of the last things they want as organizers is to accept papers that then pull out right before the conference because you just didn't have time. So that's valuable as well. And generally when you're communicating that, you'll want to think about integrating it into a few components of your abstract. The first component is your statement of your research question, which you'll want to make sure to be really clear about. And usually along with this, you'll want to have just a little bit of theory and background to contextualize why your research is important and relevant. So generally that'll be like a couple of paragraphs. Then you'll want your data and your research methods. This is something that you want to have enough description so that, again, people can see the innovation of it if that is something you're focused on. Show people that you're doing things correctly, that you've thought the method out pretty well. But remember, this is a short space. So, ad nauseum about your data and method is something you probably want to avoid. Just focus on the key pieces to show that you've done the work correctly. And again, to highlight any relevant kind of innovations. And then finally, presuming that you don't have your full findings yet, you'll want to talk about the kinds of findings that will be presented. So, you might have your hypotheses. You might talk about kind of tied to data and research methods, what sort of analyses you'll be doing. And along with that, it's really helpful to articulate why your research will be important regardless of what you find. Because sort of aligning with Nicholas's question about, what happens if your research isn't what you expect and goes in a different direction. That's often the case, especially with our hypotheses and things we expect. And so if your findings are only going to be relevant if you find a really specific thing, then that's going to be perhaps a little bit riskier for the organizers. So you want to highlight the value regardless of what you find. So in terms of like actual procedures for this, you'll upload your paper or extended abstract online. Like I said, you'll have a 150-word abstract to go with that. And then the next thing you'll do is you'll choose 2 sessions where you would like to be considered. And we'll talk about some strategies for doing that. And the organizers for both sessions will evaluate your paper. And if they both want it, they'll talk with one another and negotiate, who will get that paper. This is where you'll also decide whether you're willing to present a poster if you don't get accepted into those sessions. And do remember that you can submit more than one abstract, but you're only allowed to present at 2 sessions. So you can be the co-author on, say, a 3rd paper where you're not presenting that. So you can be on the program more than 2 times. You can just only present 2 times. Does that make sense? So after you submit it, it can kind of feel like it goes into this black box where, you have no idea what's really happening. So what's happening on the organizer's end is once they receive those submissions, they rate the papers based on their perceived quality. Of course, this is really subjective. We hopefully have enough training where, we have a good sense of, quality to a certain degree, but people are also going to be informed by their own interests and their own backgrounds and things like that. So they rate it based on quality. And then among those high quality papers, they identify themes because ideally they want a session that is cohesive. And so your paper might not always be accepted, perhaps because there's some work that could be done in terms of developing the research, but it could also be that it's a high quality paper and it just didn't cohere with the other submissions for that session. So that is something that I don't know if I based it. Maybe my submission was not high quality, but I had submitted relatively recently a paper on firearm violence that didn't get accepted. And again, it could have been that abstract needed work, but also I don't think that's a topic they get a lot. And so it could have just also not been cohesive with the other submissions. So then they'll sort of prioritize based on those 2 things, which papers they want to choose, and correspond with the other organizers who also want perhaps some of the same papers to decide who gets them. And from this process, usually a certain number of overflow sessions are created. These are beyond the sessions listed in the program, so you're not able to apply for them when you're submitting. Usually about 80 overflow sessions are created, and they're based on these themes that are identified from the submissions. And usually the most overflow sessions are created from pretty broad session titles that you're submitting to. So like if there was a morbidity and mortality one, like that's pretty broad. That's probably going to create some overflow sessions. And so that may be something you consider if you're applying to sessions is, is this a good topical fit? And also, is it broad and might create overflow sessions where maybe my chances are a little bit better because of those overflow sessions. So along those lines, how do you choose what sessions to submit to? The most important thing is to find the best topical fit. And sometimes this will be really, really clear, and sometimes it will be really, really not clear. So if it's not clear, the next thing you might want to do is to look at the organizer and think about their research interests and their approaches. If they have research interests that really closely align with yours, then your chances might be better for getting accepted. If they tend to be interested in really different things, then maybe don't prioritize that session. And this is usually something that's kind of difficult to know early in your career. So this is where your mentor's experience can be really helpful in asking them their feedback on, say, a list of sessions you're interested in, and giving them the names of the organizers and asking for their perspective. And like I said, sessions with broad topic areas are more likely to create additional sessions. That being said, they're also more likely to receive more submissions. So I would balance your decision of whether to apply to a broader session title. If, say, a broad session title has a bit of a better substantive fit than a narrower one, then I would go with that broad session title. And again, yes, more people are going to submit to it, but they'll probably also create more sessions. Any questions about that before I move on? Great. So ranking your submissions based on perceived quality sounds very abstract. So what are these organizers actually looking for? So the first goal is a little bit of cop out, like they're looking for high quality research. So that's how they rate quality. But basically what that means is they're looking for something that makes a contribution or advances knowledge in some way. And there are a lot of ways that your paper can advance knowledge. And we'll go over some of those things that you can emphasize in the next slide or two. But that's one thing they're looking at. And then again, there's the methodological side of the quality as well. Have you chosen the appropriate research design, or does your method feel like it's really far afield from what you're doing? And if you have any preliminary analyses, does it look like they've been done correctly? So this is something that it's good to be careful with. Of course, hopefully we're always careful about this, but when we're doing something like an extended abstract, we're firing it off really quickly. Maybe it can feel tempting to rush the results, but do make sure you're doing this carefully because they will be paying some attention to that accuracy. Another thing is looking for the potential impact. So your research might advance knowledge. It might improve validity. It might look at a sample of people that hasn't been really looked at before. But if people don't really care, then, then it might be a less compelling presentation. So if you're looking at just a, really small piece of the puzzle, I mean, we often are, but, an especially small piece of the puzzle or a really kind of niche topic, then that'll probably be ranked somewhat lower. So they're looking for whether your work will promote future work. So whether researchers will be interested in it. And ideally, is it relevant to policy, current events? Will it be useful for kind of the world at large? So that's something helpful to emphasize as well. And they're also looking for effective presentation. Will a clear story be told when the paper is finished? You might have really important research, really cool method, it's really well done, but if your extended abstract is really disorganized and hard to read, they're probably going to worry that your presentation is going to be disorganized and hard to follow. And plus it'll just make it harder to figure out what you're saying to begin with. So it's something that I think is often underappreciated, but is really important when you're writing your abstract. And then, like I mentioned, they want to make sure you can pull this off in time. So again, that's all kind of abstract. So I'm going to move to some more kind of concrete recommendations for how to have a good submission. So one of those is having a clear title that conveys the purpose of the paper. So I always am really tempted to have titles that are very clever and have puns, and things like that. But this is maybe not the best forum for that because people are so short on time when they're reading your submissions. So having a clear descriptive title that's not overly long can be helpful. Another thing is to organize your paper well. Use headings. Don't have a massive block of text that's a real drag to read. It helps to have, a space between paragraphs, for example. So that can also really help people read your paper quickly and get a good sense of what you're trying to say. Clearly and concisely show the contribution that you're making. So remember that reviewers will spend probably 5 to 15 minutes reviewing your submission, not because they're being careless, but because they often have 20 to 150 submissions to read. And so because of that, you really want to keep that in mind. Kind of like if you're putting together like a resume and you really want to clearly highlight your key roles. This is sort of similar, highlighting your key contributions. And like I said, an unclear submission is maybe not the best sign for what your presentation will be like. So make sure to keep that in mind as well. Remember, of course, this is competitive, so you're up against a lot of people. And so again, important to be clear. So I keep saying, make sure to highlight your contribution, make sure that your research comes off as important and innovative, but that's really intimidating. I think, again, especially when you're early in your career, it can be sometimes hard to identify what contribution you're making. I think it's important to remember that almost all research is incremental, and that's totally okay. And so when you're thinking about your contribution, these are some things you might think about and ask yourself, is my research doing this? Can I highlight this? So one thing might be using new data or methods. So you might be using a new data source, you might be using an innovative method, and that can have a big contribution because it might improve the validity of the research. It might make it more kind of applicable to the general population or to underrepresented groups. It might make the research more robust. You might be able to ask new questions that people haven't asked before. So if you're, say, doing textual analysis with like web scraping, that's like a relatively new innovative method that allows you to ask new questions that, can't be asked with more traditional data sources in many cases. So that's a really helpful thing to highlight. Something we're often doing too is looking at mechanisms, trying to explain relationships. And so if you're identifying a new mechanism or an understudied mechanism and helping to explain a relationship, that's really big and important, especially because it's usually only by understanding why a relationship exists that we can develop policies and interventions to address potentially problematic relationships. So if you're looking at mechanisms, definitely highlight that kind of policy and literature relevance. Something we also often are looking at are moderators. Are relationships stronger for particular groups compared to others? Or looking at a new population of interest. And so you are showing perhaps important variability. You are perhaps tackling questions related to equity or disparities. And so that's also really important to highlight. Also looking at moderators is really valuable because it can target research attention. If you're finding that relationships are especially strong for particular groups, that's helpful for literature and for researchers to know. You might identify a new source of spuriousness. So, always a little bit inconvenient when you expect a particular relationship, but, you put in a confounder and then all of a sudden the relationship you were hoping to look at maybe goes away. But you might still highlight that. You might say, wow, like here's an important confounder that we haven't considered before. So that could be sort of a silver lining. And you might just be looking at a relationship in more detail than has been done previously. Maybe people have not, again, accounted for all these important confounders. Maybe they haven't looked at it with a nationally representative sample. All sorts of things you could highlight there. And one of the trickiest things to do, but it's definitely something that is valuable, is are you challenging prior research in some way? You might be challenging theoretical perspectives or highlighting that prior research has been incomplete because they haven't looked at a particular group or a particular mechanism. That can be sometimes difficult if it rubs people the wrong way, so be careful about that. But that is definitely very important. And like I said, just remember most contributions are incremental. So your contribution might be something like creating a new theory or looking at something that nobody has ever looked at before. And that's awesome if that is. But again, just the reality is most of us will be making contributions like the ones listed here that are moving research forward in a smaller but still really important way. Are there any questions about these? Okay. Like I mentioned before with the full paper, but again, just want to highlight here as well, you don't need to have any results yet. Again, it's a really common question. Totally fine if you don't have results. You just have to have a doable research idea. You also, like I said, need to clearly articulate what your contribution is, regardless of what your results show. So some examples of that is if you're looking at a population or a question that's understudied, your results will be important regardless of what you find because that group is understudied. So like you need to just know more about that group regardless or that question. Or if you're looking at a mediator or moderator and it has a null association, that can be a bit of a bummer sometimes if it goes against your hypotheses. But if a moderator is null, you're finding that the relationships don't really differ across groups. Maybe you highlight that a phenomenon is more widespread than, or your findings suggest that it is more widespread than previously thought. It can also be helpful for future research to not focus on a moderator that isn't going to be really relevant. Or if your mediator is null, then again, another case of, that's valuable to know that this doesn't effectively explain the relationship you're observing. So again, it's a tricky thing when you don't find what you're expecting, all of your results are null, but again, this is maybe a way of suggesting that they're still valuable for future research. They suggest potentially some valuable things. Another important thing in this short space is to make good use of tables and figures because they can really quickly communicate a lot. So first of all, tables and figures should be able to stand alone. So your title, your legend, your axes, all of those should be really clear so that people don't have to read all of the surrounding text to get what you're saying. It's also valuable in a table or a figure to identify your data source that is based on and your sample size, either in a title, in a footnote, or perhaps within the table or figure itself. Remember to use an intelligible color design or scheme. So just remember, for example, people are more likely to be red-green colorblind. So perhaps don't pick red and green as your sole colors for your figures. Or you might also think about how if some people are printing this, they might have black and white printers. So, maybe you use a grayscale where things come across. So just some things to keep in mind, not a make or break thing, but something that can come off as a little more professional. If you're comparing groups, make sure those groups are clearly defined. And if you don't have results yet, but you want to kind of take advantage of the usefulness of things like tables and figures, maybe you think about creating a conceptual model or diagram to highlight your key relationships. That can be really helpful for showing that you've put a lot of effort into thinking through those relationships, thinking through the variables that you're most interested in. And so towards that end, show that your research idea is kind of more doable and farther along if you don't have results. If you have a really confusing kind of set of relationships you're looking at, that can also be really helpful. So these are a couple of examples. I'm not saying they're perfect, but this is a figure I used in a PAA submission and presentation. And so just to highlight some things you might consider. So this is an example where the title of the figure is pretty descriptive. So it's looking at the relationship between segregation experienced at age 17 and neighborhood poverty rates in adulthood for intermetropolitan migrant and non-migrant Blacks, results from fully specified multivariate mixed effects models, from panel study of income dynamics. Sample size is, close-ish to 19,000 people. So you can get a pretty good sense of what this is supposed to be showing. And migrants are solid, non-migrants are dotted. ggplot legends are not my favorite ever. But, you can kind of see what's going on and pretty quickly get a sense of, oh, cool. So not cool, but as segregation increases, neighborhood poverty rates tend to increase. Migrants, that relationship seems to be shallower and not much of a gender difference. So that's sort of what you want to keep in mind is, is this standalone? If I just put this up on a single slide, will it make some sense? Can I tell a story? So that's kind of the key thing. And again, I went for a grayscale because it was sort of more printable. When you're actually presenting for a PAA, that's when you might think about cooler colors. I put this here as an example of a conceptual diagram if you don't have any results, because I was sometimes confused about what a conceptual diagram meant when I was in grad school. So this is kind of what I mean by it. And this is an example from a paper I'm working on currently, where, again, not saying this is perfect. I was just a little lazy and pulled it from stuff I've been working on. But here you can see I have my outcome on the far right, looking at suicidal ideation, looking at the direct relationships, which are these solid lines between disruptive life events, cumulative stressors and covariates. And then I have dotted lines showing kind of indirect relationships. So this is one of those things where there's a lot going on. It's kind of hard to describe it sometimes. And so if you have a conceptual diagram, it's a little bit easier to point to that and say, I'm looking at these interrelationships between variables. So that might be something that you consider as well. And then finally, tables. Tables are tricky. Again, not saying this is perfect, but if you have a lot of results to show, just remember that there is limited space. So you might think about highlighting kind of key relationships. So this was a study where we were looking at the relationship between exposure to a shooting and depression among mothers. And so the title describes what we're looking at. We have the source. We have a footnote describing all the covariates that we included. And we were looking at 3 different outcomes. We had bivariate and multivariate models, and we used 2 different methods to look at the relationships. And so this was a helpful way of really consolidating the key findings and highlighting the important results. I personally tend to like seeing the results for covariates in papers, but for the sake of something where you have very limited space, this is one way you might think about really consolidating. A lot of papers in journals like JAMA and health journals have really good examples of very concise tables. So if your literature perhaps has fewer examples of really concise tables, that might be a good resource to look for how people are doing this in a really quick way. So That was the main set of material I had. So are there questions about anything I've discussed? Anything with those like last examples? Anything at all?
I have kind of a question, just more like, do you have tips on this? So in previous fields that I've worked in, when you're applying to a conference, it's always been suggested that you try to use the language that is broad enough so that if your research isn't done, you haven't painted yourself into a corner. If you need to change something, do you have any like thoughts about that? Or like tips on like language to avoid so that if we have to change something that isn't too substantive, that we aren't kind of misrepresenting what we will be talking about?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, and that's also, I guess, kind of tied to what Nicholas was asking earlier in terms of like, what happens if things totally change? So you're right that it's helpful if you're in a very early stage, and it's kind of hard to tell what direction exactly it's going to go in. It could be helpful to be broader. Some key ways you would do that is like with your research questions that you're highlighting, where maybe instead, if you're looking at the determinants of something, maybe you don't list out those determinants, but maybe you say, we're going to look at the individual, familial, and contextual determinants of, this phenomenon. Or if you're interested in disparities in a relationship, maybe you say like, we're looking at disparities across demographic groups, and that can mean like a lot of different things. You still want to clarify the contributions, and so in that sense, if you're going broad, you'll probably especially want to be clear about what those contributions are. But the research question is where you could be a little bit broader. And then in the data and methods, you might want to focus a little bit more on the sample, describing the sample, and describing, you might have a couple of methods that you say you're going to try. Like we'll do this method and we'll check the robustness with like this other method. And that gives you some flexibility in terms of what you do. So I do think, again, if it's a really early stage, it can be helpful to be broad. You just also want to make sure you're really clear about that contribution. That's where you do want to have like, especially some specificity. Does that help?
Yeah, thanks.
Any other questions or follow-ups or comments? Certainly, if people have also recommendations, based on people's questions, that's really helpful to say as well. I'll just note too, on the subject of like, do your results change? Again, I've had this happen. I've also been in presentations where the discussant has a totally different paper than what is presented. And it can be a little awkward, but it happens with some frequency. So again, it's not end of the world for that to happen. I think the important thing is people want to have interesting presentations. And so to the extent that your research is probably going to be, if you went in a different direction, you probably did it because it's more interesting that way. That's the important thing to the organizers. Any other questions?
So obviously there's going to be a balance between kind of like justifying the importance of your research and also like really kind of pitching your research, and your research is really being pitched in like your background and theory section, right? And so what kind of proportions, like, I know we're looking for quality, but like, would you say that typically in an extended abstract for PAA, you're probably doing a lot more writing in the like background and theory section, and then the data and methods are much more succinct? Like, Where do you
Yeah,
hang your
that's-
hat here?
That's a good question. So it depends on what kind of contribution you're making. So if your contribution is more substantive in terms of like theories are incomplete, prior literature hasn't, looked at this, then in that case, you'll probably spend, maybe the first page or so contextualizing that and talking about the gaps you're helping to fill. If a lot of your contribution is about the method and an innovative method and a new sample, that's where, you might need less time to talk about the prior research, and you focus on like what's cool about your sample or your method. So again, I would look to what is the contribution you're trying to make, and use that to guide how much time you spend in a particular area. Usually for me, the contribution I've been making has been filling gaps I perceive in the literature, and more time is spent on that theory and background. But again, that does vary. Other questions people have?
I was wondering if, say, for example, you were planning to submit this work also to be published around the same time that PAA occurs, or maybe like slightly before it, and say the journal has like an embargo or something, does that cause issues with you like presenting your work in another setting if they have an embargo?
That's a good question. So that's something you'd want to clarify with the journal, because of course, you don't want to go against their recommendations. Usually, like I personally haven't ever had that issue. Usually it's the case that just because the publication process takes so dang long, that, it comes out anyway after the conference. Generally, conferences prefer that you haven't published before you present. So that's also something that's kind of like helpful to keep in mind. But of course, people do often do it. So a lot of journals will still be okay with that. But again, that's something to clarify if you have concerns with the particular journal. Usually conferences also prefer that you're not presenting the same research at multiple conferences. That is something a lot of people still do. So it's like honor system. But again, the idea with conferences is that you're presenting new research where you're getting feedback that could help, the research. And so ideally, the organizers are hoping that's the kind of stage it's in, where it's like sort of close to completion, but you can take feedback from people as well. Other questions, clarifications?
I don't know if this is necessarily a question, but it was an experience where, and I guess I'm curious if this is specific to PAA, but I was on a project where we submitted, but it was sort of group research. And it seemed that the structure of it was that there's one presenter. And so there was some flexibility with the format once we got to it. And I don't know if that was just because it's virtual, but I was curious if that is something that is more unique to PAA. In terms of how many people, based on the number of collaborators versus the designated presenters, and what that looks like in collaborations versus solo research.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say at the conferences I've been at, it's usually the case that there's one presenter. Very, very occasionally are there two presenters. And so if you're doing collaborative research, that'll be a really valuable question to establish is, okay, like who's going to be presenting this? It can just be a little bit more awkward with like two presenters. But usually what I found to be the case is that one person presents, but your collaborators will be in the audience. If you're, say, the person presenting. And so during Q&A, collaborators can chime in and things like that, which is nice. So I found that with other conferences as well. And oftentimes it's the case because it's a great networking opportunity. Oftentimes, students or more junior members of the team will be offered the opportunity to present, given that it's a good resume booster. So I would say that's also relatively common and a nice opportunity to take advantage of, even if you're maybe like a little nervous about it.
That's
Any
helpful. Thanks.
follow-up questions with that? Or other questions?
Yeah, so I've never been to PAA. You said earlier in your presentation, you said it's friendly, like, because I've been to some conferences that are like aggressive. So would you say that like people are just kind of more chill and like, oh, we know that you're a student or like not done your like studentship yet? So like, are people kind, or should I, if I, luck out and get to present, should I expect kind of like armor up, like hyper ready? Like what's it like at this one?
Yeah, so I would say people are definite, in my experience, people have been really great at PAA. I've had some unfriendly experiences at other larger conferences. But I remember my very first time going to PAA, I freaked out. I was so nervous about Q&A. I did like all the background checking of my data as I could and tried to predict every single question that would come up and came up with answers for everything. And then people had good friendly feedback that was like not related to any of the complicated questions I'd come up with. So I would say that it's very friendly. Usually people do recognize that you're a student. Responses are going to be constructive and helpful, and people aren't going to tear you down. I would say it's a really rare situation. And if it does happen, most likely other people will come up to you and be like, oh my gosh, like, sorry that happened. So I wouldn't worry about it or take it personally if it does happen in the unlikely event. Any other questions?
I have kind of a like, maybe this is dumb. So there are like a handful of words in every kind of like conference sphere that you don't use. Like people are sick to death of hearing the word crisis. Don't use crisis in your extended abstract. Are there any like words where people are just like, no, it's amateur hour. Stop using it.
Let's see, I would say throughout history, that's sort of the classic one.
Yeah.
Gosh, let's see. I would say there aren't any hot button ones I've heard like, definitely don't say that. It might be helpful to take a look at demography for things like stylistic rules. Sometimes there are, particular ways people are saying you should, like if you have a table with like confidence intervals or things like that, if there are recommendations for that. I haven't submitted to demography recently, so off the top of my head, I don't know if there have been changes. Or if you are looking at, say, perhaps demographic differences across, gender or race and ethnicity or sexuality, maybe just take a look if there are recommendations for, say, capitalization or use of terminology or things like that that can be valuable. But I would say that there aren't any terms I can think of that super raise red flags. Maybe the one thing would be if you're overly ambitious about causal language. That tends to be something that rankles people at conferences and in terms of journal submissions, if you're not using expressly causal methodology.
And when you say 2 to 4 pages, that's single spaced, what's the standard?
Yeah, I would say I've always done single spaced. I'm sure they don't mind if you do double spaced, but it's just going to be really hard to fit everything in. And I don't think that includes like bibliography. I don't think you have to include that as part of it. Any other questions? Okay, well, this is the last thing I'll go over. And again, if you have more questions that you come up with, feel free to shout them out. I can also stay longer if other people prefer to leave. But like I said, submissions are due September 26th. And so what I've done in terms of submitting your abstracts and getting feedback is try to create a schedule so that you have time to prepare and then time to incorporate feedback. So if you would like to get peer and faculty feedback, make sure to send your abstracts to me by Tuesday, September 7th. It's the day after Labor Day. And I do ask that you send it by 12 p.m. so I can get it to your reviewers that afternoon. I have been able to get a hold of the faculty that you all listed. And I think for everyone was able to get the first person you listed as your faculty reviewer. So Tuesday afternoon, I'll send it to that reviewer and they'll have a week to give feedback. And then I'll send it back to you with their feedback. Also, if you are hoping to get feedback, I'll pair you with another person who would like peer feedback as well. And we'll organize that, send the person the abstracts to review. And then similarly, you will have that 1 week to review it and send back feedback so that you have just under 2 weeks to incorporate it. In terms of faculty and peer feedback, we do emphasize that people give feedback in terms of some of the key things I mentioned. Is it clear in terms of showing the contribution? Is it, pretty well organized? Again, soundness of argument is really like, did they sort of clearly show that it's important, interesting, and did they effectively display that they can do it in the time allotted? Sometimes this will need to be kind of, it'll really be the case that you need to be like, I can do this in the time allotted. But if it's really ambitious, is there a sense that there's enough progress that it'll still be done in time? And we ask that you not focus on content or methods, since in many cases, this won't be precisely your content area. Not to mention, there can be sort of little time for people to completely pivot on content and methods if you feel like there are areas for improvement. So we do emphasize those things as key points of feedback, but I will outline all of this in the email I send to you with your peer review partners paper as well. So do let me know if you decide not to take advantage of this. I totally understand schedules can be really difficult, so you might not always have something ready in time. But if you do have it ready by September 7th, that'll be the plan. Any questions about that?
So do you want us to just in the email indicate whether or not we're also interested in peer review?
Yes, thank you. Yes, do ask if you're interested in peer review. Keeping in mind that if you are interested in getting peer review, you have to give peer review. So that is the one thing to consider for that. Any other questions? Cool. Well, I will distribute the recording and the slides. Usually it takes a little while for the recording to process, but I'll distribute that this afternoon. In case you'd like to review, feel free to email if you have questions. And if I don't hear from you before then, I'll be emailing you on the 7th, probably sending you a reminder before then as well about that deadline.
Thanks so much, Christine. This has been really helpful.
Thank you.
thank you.
Good to see you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye, everyone.
Have a good weekend.